welcome everyone to this session about measuring progress and results on transitional justice. First of all, I'd like to thank the Knowledge Platform Security and Rule of Law for the opportunity and to have this discussion. And I also have the pleasure of introducing my colleagues today. Joining me is I'm doing the order that they are on my screen. Dr. Salif Nimaga is a professional evaluator, researcher, and peace-building consultant. Next to him in my screen is Dr. Geoff Dancy, an associate professor in the Department of Political Sciences, Tulane University in New Orleans, and specialist in transitional justice. Madame Ibtihel Abdellatif, an activist, researcher, and former head of the Women's Commission of the Tunisia Truth and Dignity Commission. And Devota Nuwe, the head of program of Refugee Law Project in Uganda, an organization that also works with ICTJ there. And this session will try and define and unpack some issues related to measuring progress and results of transitional justice. And this is sometimes difficult and noisy, but there is also a lot of interest about evidence and on results and how to make assessments work better. So the purpose of this session is to present some ideas, to build a common understanding, and to look seriously and unpack some issues related to the theory and the practice of what to measure and how in transitional justice processes. We wanted at ICTJ, by the way, my name is Mateo Porciúncula. I'm a senior DME specialist at the International Center for Transitional Justice. And what we wanted to do here is also to have a conversation that links the perspectives of different users in the sector of the academia, evaluators, practitioners, donors, and to help us come together and think. And that's why also we are having this panel that's quite diverse. I will share my screen now because I will do a presentation. It's about 7 minutes, give or take, and it's and I think I can do this from here now. There we go. During the course of the presentation, I will perhaps ask some questions. You will be able, the audience will be able to do it to answer in the chat. I want to tackle 4 points quickly. One is what to measure, when and for who, when we're talking about measuring things in transitional justice processes. Then address a few elements why measuring transitional justice is difficult. Go over quite lightly over the discussion about global indicators for transitional justice and present some suggestions and recommendations. This is all based on research we have been doing in the past few months. And I would like then to discuss with the rest of the panelists here the recommendations and what they think. And each of them will have an opportunity to present. Because this is a defined stage, we would like to go first tackling definitions, and I will use an analogy here. The analogy of the medical sciences, in which you have this situation like a disease, a flu. You have the population, and we think of an intervention. This could be the vaccine that has a result. And this is the basic framework of evaluation science, in which the result, in this case of the vaccine, could be, for example, the increased antibodies and defenses to protect from the disease. And perhaps on the longer term, the impact of this would be that there is a diminished contagion rate, right? And this is how things are thought. And I thought, well, we could apply this evaluation lens to transitional justice and think of this as we have this population that has suffered. In this case, they have suffered massive human rights violations. They might have suffered authoritarianism, conflict, and we are devising, societies are thinking interventions, the typical measures, policies, reforms, commissions to target this problem, and they expect results. And perhaps one of the first problems when thinking what to measure is that there are different results that are claimed of transitional justice: peace, democracy, rule of law, revealing the truth, reducing corruption. And we see that there is a little bit of an issue of meaning, because people will come to the table with different meanings, and then therefore for them what is important to measure is one thing. For example, a lot of people consider transitional justice to be only the realm of criminal accountability, and therefore there will be much focus on that and not perhaps so much in other things. But at the same time, people will legitimately, actors will come to the table with different ideas of what they want. And therefore, there will be some contestation in what the outcome of these processes might be. And here I have a question for the audience, and this is a question I'm asking Nora to ask. Whether, in your experience, governments and domestic actors that are setting up TJ processes, whether they incorporate systems to collect data and measure results and so far. I think that having a conversation about what success would look like, how do we measure, how do we know this is having an effect, is important, could be important to help raise these differences to the surface, but also to create this hunger for evidence and data that then will help throughout the process to make decisions that are evidence-based. So I agree with the public that to sometimes and rarely they are saying this happens, but it's not a common practice, and sometimes it's a bit erratic. I'm moving then to the intervention, to the when, right? And we have this intervention, the vaccine coming in, and we see there are 3 moments for this. The public is, the audience has spoken, is the mode is rarely, and this is consistent with what we have discussed internally as well. There are 3 moments. The moment in which these interventions are thought and conceptualized. There is a moment in which they are being implemented. The vaccination campaign is going on, or the commission is working. The reparations committee is working on reparations, and there is a moment in which this is finished and there are results. And one of the findings of our research is that, I'm sharing results with you of the previous question. One of the findings of the research that we have been doing is that most of the focus when we're discussing evaluation and measuring is on this 3rd moment when things are finished, and not so much in the very beginning when things are being thought, and sometimes in the middle, this monitoring of things. Although there are examples of the 3, we, as ICTJ is a victim-centered organization, a citizen-centered organization, we think that the earlier on we collect data and we start having this discussions, is the more you can use the information to do things, to make changes, to intervene. When things are done, it's over, and therefore you cannot really go back. You have to start again. We also think that for the purpose of collecting evidence for larger processes, having baselines is also useful. And my question to the audience this time is, to what extent you think programs, and I mean official, but also programs that support transitional justice, incorporate this sort of prior assessment, these definitions? Because here is where the question is important of who is making the decision about what is a success, who is being left out, what perspective could be included. Perhaps we can use data collection to include perspectives of this. What are the difficulties we're going to face? And I see similar results. I'm going to go over quickly because of time. Third, why this is difficult? And I'm going to share this, measuring this is a bit difficult because of a little bit of expectations. We have this models, logical models that assume transitional justice goes smoothly, like a train leaving a station and going to forward with very clear sometimes predefined indicators of things going on, which I think is a bit unrealistic, because in our experience, we see that transitional justice processes behave more like this, like a boat in a sea with a storm. So progress is not so clear. Sometimes you have to change the course because of the different winds going on. It's fragile, this can sink. And therefore, that has implications in measurement, because you need to predict some sort of unpredictability. You cannot stay with the same indicators you had in the beginning. You might need to collect some other data that tells a story of what's going on, or how things relate to one another. And I'm going to discuss, go over this very quickly, but one issue is that TJ is political, so there are political decisions being taken, not only technical ones. Second is that it behaves in a complex manner. There might be moments in which nothing seems to happen, but then you reach a tipping point and everything happens. And third, the context in where we work are difficult, and therefore we have additional issues. And I'm going to skip a little bit going deeper into this, because I think my panelists will speak to some extent to this. But just a little takeaway is that because of this, maybe there is a little bit too much focus on quantitative indicators, and we need more qualitative or mixed methods approaches, and methods that allow for capturing uncertainty, capturing relationships, the political stances of actors and stuff like that. Complexity, I'm not going to go there. Go to capacity for a moment. And here is first that this is for every evaluator ever. This is not only for transitional justice. I think this is especially important for transitional justice because of the situation of vulnerability and the situation of having to deal with very loaded subjects as human rights violations, which is first capacity, the state, whether they can use the data that we are producing, whether they have the people with the technical ability to do so, what security is there to collect data, and whether you're risking people, whether the state is present everywhere or not. There are issues of exclusion, and so gender, how is it taken into account? Marginalized people, youth, how do you make your data collection capture and reflect the perspectives of those that are left out? Sometimes, and then issues of power. Who is making the definitions? What language are you using? What words? And how do you allow the stories of what's actually going on color the results you have, the indicators that you define? And this is something I think some of my panelists will address here below. Related to the issue of global indicators, I'm not going to discuss this much now here, but we think the SDG framework has the potential of being very positive because it contains the elements of justice, rule of law that are important for transitional justice, and every country has agreed, or most every country has agreed to it. So it's something that we think it's useful to link. But at the same time, the indicators that are defined there do not necessarily always work for this. But I will want to discuss this later with them. And finally, and some suggestions I'm throwing out there for the audience and the other panelists to discuss is some ideas is to include a discussion on how to monitor progress and what results to get early on. Try and establish how to use data with the actors involved and connecting them with academia or organizations, external organizations. Use these efforts to collect data to make the data, the process more inclusive, address all these issues I mentioned before, evaluate the institutional capacity to use data, consider whether this is an opportunity also to build legitimacy of these processes because they're evidence-based, link it with SDGs, supporting these prior assessments and this definition, the data at the definition stage, include the political dimension in the design, and consider the long-term perspective, because I would say these processes have a long tail and they don't necessarily produce results right away, and then therefore you will need perhaps efforts that go longer. But I think I will stop right here and leave the floor to my colleagues. I think you might still be seeing the the final part of the presentation, but I would like to ask questions of my colleagues here just now. I perhaps would start with Salif. I will ask you to take the floor, and perhaps you can tell me about what is your experience related to this TJ as a political matter. What in your opinion you think could be done to improve programs and the way they are designed and measured, and also to react to what we have just presented, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you also in general for having this opportunity to speak here to this on this panel on these issues that are very broad but also very exciting and dear to my heart. I will speak mainly from the perspective of external support to transitional justice measures, because this is what you come in contact mostly as an evaluator. What we see, a lot of external support to transitional justice fails or falls short because interventions are framed in technical terms based on global norms concerning accountability and the fight against impunity. The reason for this is often a lack of national ownership on the one hand, but also the fact that technical capacity development in forms of trainings, logistical support, and other things is comparatively easy to measure. However, even where these approaches succeed, they do not tell us much in terms of the change in regard to accountability and the recognition of victims, or even more long-term goals, such as rebuilding trust into institutions as well as reconciliation. I'm not claiming that better design and monitoring and evaluation will be able to solve all of these issues, but there's definitely room for improvement, and building on what you have said, I will focus on 7 points. First, start early. Including monitoring and evaluation considerations right from the start is crucial. Early assessments will provide the opportunity for including political analysis, as you have mentioned, establishing baselines, and determine what success would look like. For example, when we talk about advancing a justice agenda, does this only include elements of punitive justice, or does this also include restorative justice elements? The answer to these questions must then also be reflected in the data that you're going to collect. So there are some crucial decisions to be made in the beginning. Second, be inclusive. Include a broad set of national stakeholders into the design of monitoring and evaluation systems. This would ideally include governmental and non-governmental actors, representatives of victims associations, representatives from different social and professional groups, as well as from a broad geographical distribution. Assure that women and youth are included and heard. Third, you also pointed to this already, mix quantitative and qualitative data. Both quantitative and qualitative information have their place in the monitoring and evaluation of transitional justice processes. We might want to know how many cases have been in front of the criminal courts, how many women have participated in the hearings before a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what the annual household income of victims of human rights violations is, and what percentage of military personnel might have been involved in torture cases. On the other hand, we might need a more nuanced understanding of how the population in general and victims in particular conceive of broad concepts such as reconciliation, and what meaningful contributions to reconciliation, institutional trust, or social cohesion would look like. Fourth, combine result and process indicators. Many results stemming from transitional justice processes will only manifest over long time frames. It is helpful to break down bigger results into milestones that can be tracked as parts of a results-based monitoring system. In many cases, however, process indicators describing the quality of transitional justice processes might complement results-based indicators in a meaningful way. For example, we could look at describe the inclusivity of transitional justice processes. Who participates? What is the quality of the participation? What is the impact of participation on decision-making, and so on. Fifth, don't forget about conflict sensitivity. Transitional justice processes are politically contested, as you have mentioned, and often unfold in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. So providing external support to such processes can lead to unintended negative consequences. Monitoring systems should therefore be set up in a way to allow for tracking the interaction between programs and the context, thus detecting unintended negative impacts. An example that is usually included in many transitional justice processes is the issue of victim protection, as we know that once victims come forward and participate, In public processes, there is the risk of repression or attacks on their physical integrity, and this is one element where this conflict sensitivity plays out, but there are definitely more. 6, you already mentioned this as well, plan for the long term. Monitoring and evaluation systems should be designed for the long term, given the time frame of the changes that can be expected. One thing that is often missing is longitudinal data, which tracks indicators over time. Given the non-linearity of change in the area of transitional justice, this longitudinal data is also particularly important as it provides the foundation for evidence-based comparisons over time. This information might even be useful long after the end of a program, as future efforts can go back to this information if it is made publicly available. And 7th, use the information. As an evaluator, you see that monitoring and evaluation is often a neglected topic. Even more problematic, I find, is that a lot of energy is used to collect data that is never used for learning, accountability, or program adaptation. So if monitoring and evaluation is just treated as a checking the box exercise, and this information is not used, then one might as well have saved the resources that went into producing this information in the first place. So just to repeat again, my 7 points: start early, be inclusive, mix quantitative and qualitative data, combine results and process indicators. 5th, don't forget about conflict sensitivity. 6, plan for the long term. And 7, use the information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Salif. Thank you for your discipline regarding time, and we agree on most counts. I will open the floor now to the other panelists if they want to quickly have a reaction to this. And if not, I will just move on to next in line, because we do have a lot of ground to cover. Geoff, Dancy, Devota, any comments? All right. Yes.
I'll just address them whenever I speak. I mean, yeah. So I'll just wrap my comments into.
All right. Then, well, I'm going to then move on to second question. I'm going to ask Ibtihel. Because Ibtihel, you are bringing the perspective from the practice, and we are happy to discuss this from our points of view. But I would like to know from your experience at the Women Commission in Tunisia's IBD, how that data was used, and what was the experience there, and what do you think of these comments and suggestions we have been saying just now, and how perhaps similar institutions in other places, what they could do in order to get data on time and use it, because that's, I think, the main takeaway here. The floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I will speak about our experience in Tunisia. The transitional justice experience is mainly confronting the past and looking transgressions for the purpose of dealing with it. As a member of a Truth Commission, I choose to be honest with myself and not refuse to apply this principle to us and accept criticism of the Tunisian experience. I think we need to value its gains and build on it and show its deficiencies so that we can correct its mistakes in the next stage of the process, and so that others in the world can learn from our experience and avoid our mistakes, as we have learned a lot from comparative experience. I consider that the most important gains of the Tunisian experience and best practices focused on the gender aspects are the following. Our relative success in raising women victims' awareness about the need to submit their files to the Commission. This made that the submission percentage increased from 5% to 23% thanks to several means to reach out to them. We succeeded in breaking the silence of these women by creating an important representation for them in the public hearing sessions, where 17 women victims out of 30 witnesses participated in the first six public hearings. However, we did not cover all groups and violations. Another best practice we were able to achieve is the approval of 5% positive discrimination for reparation to women compared to men, and This recognition that the effects of violations on women in conservative societies are deeper than the ones on men. With regard to your question about how to use the data, any institution should have a clear vision from the beginning, a controlled methodology, and also highly qualified experts in informatics and in statistics also from the beginning of the work, so that the extracted data is sound and can be used for analysis and intersections between files, investigation and reparation. What happened in the Tunisian experience is that we listened in private hearings to 80,369 women out of more than 14,000 files submitted by women to commission 55%. As for the question that we put in the statement form, they were comprehensive and accurate in their entirety with some open questions. Unfortunately, we discovered at a certain stage that the application of the statement form was not successful and had many flaws in its design. And we could have fixed it by appointing highly qualified experts, but this did not happen. It's also necessary to develop a guide for the statement takers in which a clear definition of all terms and steps necessary in listening exists, so that the concepts are unified and clear to them. And this also not happened until 2017, given the completion of the private hearing process. And we discovered that there are major deficiencies in the treatment of the data and the statement form, and there are interventions and wrong directions were given to the statement takers. So instead of putting data on sexual abuse in its part of the statements, they only put it in the category of torture. So we found wrong and contradictory statistics, especially on the issue of sexual violence, that do not reflect the truth of this violation. As the head of the Women's Committee, I demand statistics about violations so that we can analyze them. But until the last day of our work, we did not reach us. The statistics were not prepared. I was surprised when the final report was published that there are wrong and contradictory statistics that do not really reflect the testimonies we have seen at the Women's Committee on Sexual Violence. The percentage of rape and all forms of sexual violence did not exceed 0.06, and rape 0.16, and in another column, the form of sexual violence were of 1.06, and this is a sample of the confusion. Therefore, the Commission's report was considered to have failed to reveal the truth about the violations against the victims, including women. It did not succeed in creating intersections between the files, because the majority of those who worked on these files were lawyers without any previous experience, and general descriptions of these violations was satisfied without analysis or in depth. And huge archives were not exploited. We used only a very small part in our work. Also, we didn't make the comparison between time periods and comparison between violations in different events, such as the period of Bourguiba and Ben Ali, and why this difference in the use of torture tools and sexual violations, for example. With regard to the experience of gender and ability, it was considered that it was not represented, that the majority of the male victims were denied the right to hold their perpetrators accountable and to reduce impunity. Very few files relate to the various violations that occurred against women were transferred to the special chambers. As I said, as an investigation, this file was carried about inexperienced lawyers, and it would have been better to contract judges and law doctors so that the results would be better. With regard to reparation, the victims' requests included in their files were not taken into consideration, and statistics could have been extracted from them if the application was sound. Instead, a national consultation was undertaken for association and civil society on reparations, and to my opinion, this does not dispense with the importance of what came of requests in the victim files. Finally, the Women Committee, we tried to analyze some violations and develop them in qualitative studies, including a study on sexual violations. and their impacts on women and their expectation from transitional justice mechanism. This was a project with the British University of York, a random of sample of 50 women victims of rape and sexual violence from various political families was selected. This study was supervised by specialists in sociology, law, and psychology. We came up with a very important conclusion about the effects of this violation on women, children, and the family. And
oh, hello.
We've got a bad internet connection, so Mateo, I'm asking you to go further.
All right. Well, okay, these things happen. We'll move on to the next. I wanted to discuss a couple of things that Ibtihel mentioned, but I would like to, because of this situation, we'll move on. I'll ask my colleague Devota Nuwe to participate now. I have a couple of questions for you as well, and I'm asking this as a colleague and as a partner in the work in Uganda, and we mentioned a few things about assessment of transitional justice programs, and what could you say regarding how to collect data to make sure that the perspectives of beneficiaries are better understood? We mentioned a few things before, how to inform policy decisions, and also what would you like to say in terms of expectations and the timing to register significant change? Perhaps sometimes there's moments when nothing appears to be changing. So Devota, the floor is yours, and you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mateo. Greetings, everyone. I'm Devota Nuwe from Uganda. I work with the Refugee Law Project. So most of the points have already been mentioned, but when it comes to measuring transitional justice, it's not something that you can measure it in a short time, as it takes a long time. And also in terms of looking at transitional justice, at least from Uganda's perspective, is we have to look at the drivers of conflict, because we are trying to find solutions or to measure transitional justice, and yet you find that politically, those who are perpetrators of the conflict are actually still in power, and it's very hard to actually find a solution, because you are discussing with a government, or you're discussing with combatants who have different views. And also, I'll just give an example. In our context, we've had a long conflicts in northern Uganda, and right now there are 2 criminal processes taking place. So we have what's happening in the ICC, and then also locally we have prosecution. But it's difficult to tell which of the processes the population will actually see and appreciate that is actually speaks to them saying that they are satisfied with justice or accountability. But also I wanted to make a comment about political interference. When it comes to transitional justice, it's very hard to separate this. Because right now, what we are doing in Uganda with the Refugee Project, we are doing a lot of memorization of what happened with the victims' testimonies, but we find that people don't feel protected, and they don't feel that they are sharing, but also we have to reassure them about their safety, and that this is actually going to come out of the process. So right now we have a transitional justice policy that was passed in June 2019, and it took 10 years for this policy to come out. But even then, the policy left out an important accountability mechanism, and that comes in truth commissions, and then also to a lesser extent, reparation. So it's actually difficult for us to measure progress or results when you don't have some of these main accountability mechanisms of truth commissions. So it's in our context, it's difficult. Then I want to make a comment about the context of conflict. So in Uganda, we've had conflict from our independence, but that conflicts have been different. So we can't say in all the regions of the country it is homogeneous. All of the regions have different understanding about what happened in the conflict and how they should be, how transitional justice should be, the human rights abuses should be addressed. So this is something that we need to take into consideration when we are looking at measuring progress and results, that not one size fits all, and you can be speaking of one country, but then the results will be different depending on the population you're speaking to. Thank you. I look forward to answering questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Devota. I think we will move we have the reactions of the panelists maybe in the end. As Geoff said, we will also comment perhaps. I did make a few notes that are interesting to things go back. I'm sorry, Ibtihel, that your internet cut you off there, but we will have an opportunity to discuss further later. I would like finally, in this first round of discussion, to give the floor to Dr. Geoff Dancy. And here you are representing researchers and academia. And first, I would like to hear your reactions about what was discussed and your opinion on what sort of data, what would be useful, because we're speaking this idea of using the data is so important to establish an evidence base related what the outcomes are of TJ processes, and should we do anything differently, and how. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. So I feel a little bit like I've been scooped because Salif so elegantly laid out a series of points that I by and large agree with. One thing that I have kind of a visceral reaction to, though, is this distinction between qualitative and quantitative indicators, because what we're all trying to do is measure latent traits in a population of people. So it might be what they're interested in, it might be what their attitudes are, and we can measure those same traits qualitatively or quantitatively. But you're right that there is a sort of obsession with quantitative indicators, and sometimes the obsession leads us down paths that are uninteresting. So we might be collecting quantitative data just because it's easily quantifiable, at which point we've started to lose something. So I agree with that, but I don't think that there's necessarily this separation between qualitative and quantitative information. We're all qualitative information attempts to measure as well. But I'll just, I think, stack points on top of what Salif said, and then there'll just be a few. The first is that I think that we should embrace complexity without being needlessly complicated. So one of the things I've recently been reviewing a lot of international criminal court evaluation reports. So they've really made a push at the International Criminal Court to monitor and evaluate their processes. Now they've put out a report about this, and there's something like 63 indicators that they've proposed to measure, none of which are very interesting or get at the nature of the interventions that they engage in and the outcomes of those interventions. It's mainly things like, are trials expeditious? Well, we don't necessarily care if trials are expeditious. We care about how they're perceived and how people respond to them. And so you can have 63 indicators of things like expeditiousness, but if you're not measuring perceptions of fairness, you're missing something. So we need to embrace the fact that we've got to measure concepts as complicated as justice or reconciliation or the fairness of a trial or the inclusiveness of a truth commission, and not be scared by that complexity, but not address that complexity by a scattershot approach where we just throw every quantitative indicator at it that we have, because there's no design there. We can measure things as complicated as reconciliation qualitatively and quantitatively, but we have to very carefully design how we do it. And usually those measures need to be rooted in people's perceptions. And so we can do that. We can measure people's perceptions and the way that they change over time, but we have to be equipped to do it. Which brings me to the second point, which is that we've got to do something to measure people's attitudes over time. And so this is hard because in a lot of places, I study Sri Lanka, for example, there's very little political will to engage in transitional justice processes or set them up to succeed. They're usually set up to fail. So if we're going to measure attitudes over time, and we're doing so with the knowledge of the government that doesn't have the political will to engage in transitional justice, then that requires some kind of creativity. So oftentimes, if we do want to measure people's attitudes, we've got to sneak in questions on surveys about development, for example, because the government is very pro-development, but not very pro-human rights. And so we have to sneak human rights questions onto surveys that are by and large about development. But this is the kind of thing that we can do. We can be creative about how we include people in the process and gather information about their attitudes, but it's an absolute must. We have to do it, and it has to be over time. And if we can ask the same people questions repeatedly, have the same respondents in different rounds of surveys or survey experiments, then we've absolutely got to do that, because that's the only way that we can really begin to understand the effects of these interventions, however good or bad the interventions are from a technical perspective, on people's changing attitudes about things like fairness or reconciliation. So that's the second point, is measuring attitudes over time, which has an added benefit of being inclusive. If you're asking a number of people what they think about a process, they feel included in that process. Just being asked oftentimes increases a feeling of inclusion, and I think that that's a positive thing. The third thing, so one is embrace complexity without complication. Two is measure attitudes over time. The third thing is measuring completion in the long term. So Salif already said this, but I just wanted to give a couple of examples. In Colombia, where there's high political will for transitional justice, there have been a couple of projects that I think are very promising. One is called the Peace Agreement Matrix, which actually takes the peace agreement and breaks it into packets and into essentially different promises or provisions that are made in the peace agreement. And then there's a project to follow how each one of those is implemented or completed over time. And it's going to be going on for years and years. There's never any will among donors to do a long-term assessment project on the outcomes of any of these processes. But it's the thing that we need the most. We've got to follow the implementation and the completion over time. So if there's some kind of recommendation that's been made, how is that recommendation put in place 5, 10, 15 years down the road? Absolutely vital. So the final thing that I'll say, and I guess I'm representing all academics here, is that one of the good things to do is partner with academics. And I'm not saying that because I want a job. I have a job. I'm saying it because what we can do, we often raise resources to do this work on our own and not in coordination with practitioners that are already putting these things into place. And so there is a very open kind of avenue for partnership there, where academics can be brought on to do some kind of survey work and work with practitioners that need advice on how to design these evaluation strategies. And yeah, and so it just it makes a lot of sense to have academics along to help with this, because we work so hard on the technical aspect of it. But I should say, and this is my final point, academics should never lead the process. They should be there to consult, to say, this is how you would design this if we were living in a perfect world, and it were all up to us to design a perfect intervention. But it's not up to us. And so we have to sit by and adapt to the circumstances. And a lot of that adaptation needs to be led by practitioners that know the context better, specialists. And then we generalists come along for advice. And so that's the final thing that I'll say.
Thank you, Geoff. There's a lot to unpack here. I will take a moment to raise 2 points, but at the same time, I will also ask the audience here to present their questions to the panelists. And I also have some time for each panelist to discuss things. So this moment, if you want, members of the audience, you think that we should go deeper in any of the many topics we have raised today, you please write on the chat the questions you might have, and then we will see about answering it. And I have a quick reaction to two things. If we focus on the use of information, I think the point that has been raised many times today about not overcomplicating things is crucial. And I'm thinking of our experience in working in places such as Colombia and other countries, in which an analysis of the capacity of the people who are going to use the information and how could that actually have an effect on decisions being made is crucial, because making things more complicated doesn't necessarily mean it will be used. It actually makes it more difficult. And the second comment I have is related to your comment, Geoff, on the development framework. That's the reason we think the SDG framework is very important, because all of the countries to a certain extent have agreed to it, and therefore this is an interesting entry point to introduce questions and assessment related to transitional justice in this framework. Whether we need to engage better with the indicators and how to make it real, that's a different question. I am asking questions I'm getting questions from the public. I'm going to wait a couple minutes while I make notes of them, but I don't know if any of the other panelists now want to jump in quickly and say anything about the previous interventions. I am assuming not so far. I don't see hands raised or comments. We do have a question from Devota. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment about the longitudinal study, a comment that was made. I think that is very important when it comes to measuring results in transitional justice, because the attitudes and the circumstances change over time. So it's important to know that results from transitional justice takes time, and it's not, and if you measure it in 10 years, it can change in 20 years. So it's important not to get a result and then peg it and say this is the result from this particular place, but it can actually change. And also the drivers of conflicts need to actually be also looked at when you're looking at the results, because most of the time we may pat ourselves on the back and say that transitional justice has been achieved, and yet there are underlying drivers of conflicts that may happen and simmer within the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Devota. We have a question from the audience. I'll raise the question openly, and then we see we answer it. Who answers it? Question is, are there any particular evaluation approaches better suited to conduct evaluation during implementation and towards and after completion of such interventions? That's the question from Niraj Rama. Any takers at this point? Do you want me to read it again?
So the question is whether there are any particular approaches that work best in the implementation or completion phase.
Yes, and I think we all have something to say, but it's just.
I'm happy to start with 2 points, maybe. I think one is just underlining what Geoff has also said. I think it's crucial to get perceptions into the mix as part of the data that is collected. It's often a weak point in monitoring and evaluations of these interventions, especially if we look at a broad set of stakeholders. And I think also some elements that were also mentioned by others. I think it's to have a broad diversity of stakeholders and their perceptions, not only focusing on victims, not only focusing on certain groups, also broad geographic distribution of where these people are, often also in remote areas that might be difficult to access. I think this is crucial in general, getting these perceptions in. And then I think one thing that one could consider is actually if we're looking at specific transitional justice mechanisms that have specific participants and specific beneficiaries, I think it might also be interesting to bring in some sort of quasi-experimental designs where we look at perceptions of people that were directly involved and also of control groups that did not make part of these interventions, because this would strengthen the evidence base of regarding some of the assumptions and theories of change that that accompany some of these transitional justice approaches, and we don't actually yet have the basis, the evidence base to actually make judgments of whether they work or not. And I think this is one way where evaluations could actually strengthen the evidence base.
My take on this question as well. I mean, there is no way of saying, no, this approach is better suited to it, because it depends on the evaluation design and the monitoring design, and it requires a good look at the context. We had been in this conference here, we have been advocating for some tips. One of them is related to what Devota and Salif said at some point, of the disaggregating data, because the gender aspect and the regional aspect might reveal different experiences of transitional justice, and therefore the interventions that perhaps should go about doing things differently in different regions, and that's and especially for populations such as women. So that's a very important point of the design. And I would also say that in ICTJ's experience, we have worked on perception surveys, and especially with stakeholders that we work with, but not necessarily having been able to do it over time. And we have also had some success in combining quantitative type of process indicators, such as delivery of certain promises, with more open-ended methodologies, such as, for example, outcome harvesting and similar methodologies that also allow to get out of the McNamara fallacy of looking at just one thing and try and get other aspects of how the process is actually going on on the ground in reality, and try and use that information to complement the other data that you're collecting. That's what I say about the matter. Is there any other question on the audience I would like to answer now, because we are just about to finish? I'm going through my chat. Okay. Okay. Comment. And this is an interesting comment. A comment from Mariana Kumu. It says that one of the aspects that need to be acknowledged is fatigue from populations that are also being questioned. One solution could be ensuring that feedback is provided so that people feel part of the process. And I can say I cannot agree more with this, because sometimes, due to the experience of then this is related to these issues of power in monitoring and evaluation, in assessment, and the role, the ethics of the evaluation. And this is something that perhaps Salif would say, well, this is something that every evaluator should do ever. But I think it's more important, perhaps in situations of post-conflict and on these subjects that are so dear and hard for people to not behave in a colonial extractivistic way of getting data out of people just to fill in a special in my box, but to be able to establish a relationship and give back to people and respect. And I think Geoff at some point also mentioned that this is also part, the assessment itself is also an intervention. And the way you ask questions, who asks the questions, how data is collected, how this respect established between the people who are giving you their answers and the statement takers, the enumerators, is also one input in making the process more legitimate. Can be, but at the same time, it also can be something that adds on to the frustration of victims related to how they feel about a process that might not be going where they want, and being constantly asked questions about it doesn't really help if it's not framed in a way that's I would say ethical and respectful. But I open the floor to others because I see faces in my panelists to say some other things.
Yeah, I'll just say something here on the last question in this one, that evaluation should all be designed around specific situations. And so that just sounds like, okay, of course it goes without saying, but that's really not what happens most of the time. It's that there's this kind of, I guess the word might be cookie cutter approach to setting up evaluation. So we're going to do this technique everywhere. But especially if we're trying to be inclusive and conflict sensitive and recognize that people disagree over these questions, then we've got to target our interventions carefully and with a lot of knowledge of the context. And that includes following up with the populations who have been questioned, who have been surveyed, and a lot of people that are respondents to surveys take surveys to be a kind of a promise. And this is something that we don't often acknowledge, but they are answering very sensitive questions about their experience, and they expect something to follow on to that. And they often aren't ever revisited or provided with the information that came out of the surveys. And so these are very simple things to address. You can simply ask people if they would like to be contacted again, if they feel safe being contacted again, if there were another round, things like this. And so we can incorporate these like an ethical approach into evaluation while also doing it in a way that's specific to the circumstance.
Yes, which is the way it has to be done. It's just that, you know, we know the practice doesn't necessarily follow sometimes, and it's I think the work of good evaluators to focus on this. We have a comment by Martin Scotsman, and we have almost run out of time. So that sometimes there are experiences of indicators being developed in a participatory way, and in which populations go, do bottom-up processes to get there. And there has been a few experiences of that in Colombia and some other places. But I would say that more participatory approaches would also, in any of these situations, help build up this legitimacy of processes. We are almost running out of time. I would like, if you have any other comments, my dear colleagues here, and I also would like to ask the participants, the audience, to, if they can, turn on their cameras to say hello and goodbye before we finish. So I give a minute for that. I see very few, I see some faces, but not all. And this is a longer conversation. We think that this is there's a lot to unpack. We have done what we could here today, but there's more to follow. I'll ask Nora to leave a link here for if you guys want to continue this conversation, and you can log in there and leave your name and whatever you want to follow up with, and we will be certain to manage that in a way that's appropriate. Salif, Devota, Ibtihel, Geoff, any last greetings or salutations? Just 1 quick minute to everyone. We do in the order we spoke. Salif first.
I'm just grateful for this exchange. I think, as you've said, it's an ongoing conversation. It's so much. I think an hour to cover all this ground has been very short, but it has been a very productive hour. So thank you very much.
Ibtihel, you're muted. You're muted, Ibtihel. And unmute yourself if you can, just quickly. There you go.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. We learned a lot today. Thank you.
Devota?
What I would like to say is thank you so much for this opportunity today. And just as my last comment is just to say that the results, and when it comes to evaluation, it takes time. And we need to look at different processes for different sets of population. That's the parting shot that I have. Thank you.
Thank you. And on my side, I would like to thank everybody and say goodbye. This has been an honor to share this panel with people so smart and well versed in the but this is an ongoing conversation, and we have the link there to continue. I appreciate the opportunity as well, and thank the Secretariat of the Knowledge Platform, Security and Rule of Law for this moment. We'll end it here. Bye bye. Yeah, it's there. Geoff, I didn't give you the word. Sorry.
It's fine.
I just realized you were not in my
I
screen.
shouldn't be the one to sum it all up. I'm just an academic. I'm just along for the ride. But no, it was great being here. I'm seeing some familiar faces now. It's good to see all of you. And yeah, context sensitivity. That's it.
Yes,
That's
please.
all.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you.